Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'll introduce myself again. My name is Abbie Ebert, and I'm a water quality monitoring specialist with DEQ, and I am currently the volunteer monitoring program coordinator also with that role. And then I'll let Rachel reintroduce herself quick.
My name is Rachel Malison. I'm an assistant research professor at the Flathead Lake Biological Station and also the program manager of monitoring Montana waters.
Awesome. And so we're here today to talk about volunteer monitoring, our programs, and why to monitor, setting goals and objectives, and then some tips about planning ahead. So that's kind of our overall topics we'll cover. So we're first going to go over DEQ's program. So our volunteer monitoring program runs the Volunteer Monitoring Lab Analysis Support Program, and that's run through the Monitoring Assessment section here at DEQ. And that section supports entities that voluntarily participate in water quality monitoring projects in Montana. And this is a competitive funding opportunity that helps offset costs associated with having water quality samples analyzed by an accredited analytical laboratory. Each year we have a call for applications go out. I know in the past that it used to be kind of more in the springtime, but last year, this year, and hopefully into the future, our call for applications will go out sometime in January. And so this year, our call for applications is going to go out on January 20th. So that will go out in the MWCC newsletter as an update. And if you are on our interested parties list, you'll also get an email that will include Rachel's program and our program's information. So if you don't think you're on that, please feel free to email me and we can get you added. And then our call for applications can be found on our DEQ website, which is listed on the screen. And the due date for that application will be February 25th by 5 p.m., which is the last Friday in February. Applicants can seek up to $5,000 for laboratory sample analysis and shipping costs associated with a water quality monitoring project. And that does not include funding for sampling and analysis plan development, travel, monitoring time, purchasing and maintaining equipment, or other operational costs. It's just for lab fees and shipping of those samples. Our application materials required when you through an email to me is our application form, sampling analysis plan, abbreviated to SAP, and then a budget table. And all of that can be found on our website. And then for more information about the program, eligibility requirements, and participation requirements, please review the call for application on the website. On top of the volunteer monitoring lab analysis support program, we do also provide technical assistance. So we can help with reviewing SAPs or SAP development for projects. We provide training to volunteer groups if staff resources are available. And then we can answer questions about monitoring or water quality or just anything that comes to mind that you would like assistance on. We're here to help. And then we also have equipment to loan out to groups. So the lab analysis program gets first preference on those equipment opportunities, but other groups can request it as well. So if you are not a part of our program but are interested in potentially getting like discharge flow meters or other sampling equipment, feel free to email me around the April timeframe. That's always a good time to see what's available if you're not a part of the program. And then another thing that I want to go over is all of our guidance documents and templates that we have on our website that have been created by DEQ and MSU Extension Water Quality. So the first one is the Sap Template to help groups kind of figure out the needed components of a SAP and provide guidance with that. We have the monitoring method selection guide, which goes over setting goals and objectives and selecting monitoring methods to meet those goals and objectives. It's a really cool guide that they've worked on. And then we also have the volunteer monitoring planning catalog that provides information to groups on what they kind of need to think about to start a monitoring project. And then lastly, we have SOPs or standard operating procedures listed on our website as well. That can be a tool for groups. And then I want to just do a quick plug for the MSU Water Quality Extension's volunteer monitoring website that has more resources as well to groups. So they have something called the Data Hub, which is a web database that provides storage and visualization tools for surface water quality data. And that's available for citizen science groups across the state. There's a basic plotting tool that's built into the database that can be used to make graphs. And then data can also be downloaded from that site. And then they also have examples of volunteer monitoring SAPs, as well as other analysis guidance and training materials for you to use. And now I will give it off to Rachel.
Thanks, Abbie. So you're going to have to make some things pop up for me as I point at you, or you can just do it right now. It doesn't matter. Anyways, Monitoring Montana Waters, or MMW, was first launched at FLBS in 2021 with the objective of just increasing the capacity for water quality monitoring in Montana, and really not to reinvent the wheel, but build on and support the efforts that have already been available through Montana DEQ and MSU Extension. So it's run by myself, and then Claire Kirk, who's with us today, also is our new Big Sky Watershed Core member. She started yesterday. And last year, Keaton Martin was our member, and he helped develop a lot of the program. So we offer scientific and technical support. So Abbie mentioned the SAP and some of the other documentation that's needed. Really, to develop a monitoring program, there's a lot of work that needs to go in on the front end so that you can make sure you're asking the right questions, and that all of the effort that you expend out in the field collecting data is actually going to answer those questions. That along those lines, MMW offers support to groups for them to, help them develop the program. We provide on-the-ground training and sampling methodologies if that's needed. We can help groups write SAPs, and that's that sample and analysis plan where you really outline the details of your project. We also provide laboratory analyses funding, and that's quite similar to the funding provided by DEQ. So our max amount per year for group is $6,000, and we do require a 50% cost match, but that can be met by volunteer time or personnel time, mileage, or let's see, also a dollar match can be used too. But it's generally pretty easy to make that match with all the time that's required to collect the samples. And our funding, just like DEQ, provides support to cover the laboratory costs of analysis and also the shipping of samples. And we also cover the filters and syringes if those are needed for your sample type. We also require an application. I forgot to put the due date on here. We're just a little bit later than DEQ, so March 1st every year. And the application form is required, as well as the SAP, and then a budget table is included in there. And those can be emailed directly to myself, and my email is there on the slide, or mw@flbs.umt.edu. We'll get those as well through that email. And there are some requirements that come with this. Groups have to sign an MOU, a memorandum of you have to file a report, and you're required to upload all of your data to the EQUIS database, and DEQ also requires those things. So that is the main part of funding. And then we also have a smaller pot of funding that's available for gear funding. So we don't loan out any equipment like DEQ, but we do provide some small amount of funding if groups need to, say, buy a water quality meter or, basic supplies, and that can be up to $1,500 a year. You have to match that 100% dollar for dollar. And our website, sorry, Abbie, I paused. Our website has all this information and a lot more resources. You can just Google MMW FLBS or the bit.ly /FLBS MMW is a shortcut to get to our website. But a lot of resources there. Always feel free to reach out to Claire or I for more information. Okay, Abby. So we just have a few slides kind of hitting on some of the big picture details. And I think most of the folks on this webinar today are pretty familiar with why you might want to monitor. But really, our waters here in Montana are world renowned for their beauty, clarity, their wild nature. If we didn't manage them and take care of them, we'd have contaminated waters. There's a few, you could just bring up all the bullet points if you want. And so we really want to be able to detect problems or change. And to do that, we have to have scientifically credible data. And Montana is really large. There's a lot of water. There's a lot of remote areas, and we have limited resources. So it makes sampling really challenging. And that's why trained volunteers are really crucial to the effort in Montana. And so that's why MMW and DEQ and MSU have all these resources to help groups, to train them, to help them develop their programs and make sure that the data that they're collecting are scientifically credible and they can be used for making management decisions. I think Abby is going to, and then of course, there's a lot of benefits. It's all of the just supporting quality. But as a volunteer, obviously you get to spend time outdoors, meet people, have fun, learn more about water quality, and really engage your community more, and hopefully educate the public too about your resources.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. So now that Rachel has gone over why monitor water quality, we're going to provide some information to help determine what's your why for your group, and help you kind of have tips and tools to create goals and objectives for your monitoring projects. So before you begin monitoring or planning a monitoring program, you need to identify why you want to begin monitoring and identify your program's goals and objectives. So what is your spark, or why do you want to monitor water quality? That spark is an idea that motivates people to get involved, benefits the community, will sustain participation, and make the investment worthwhile. Keep your spark in mind when you develop your goals and plan your monitoring objectives. That should carry you through your project. And another thing that you want to think about is you want to produce data to answer a question, confirm an assumption, create a solution, teach people, or change a behavior. So also when you're kind of in the beginning process, you want to think about what, how will that data that you produce be beneficial? And so we're going to kind of go over identifying goals. But the monitoring method selection guide that I talked about earlier is a great resource for guiding groups in creating goals and objectives. So I just want to promote that. And that's where this graphic comes from. So you'll see this if you use that. So let's first define what a goal is. So a goal is a desired outcome from an effort. So goals can be broad and help you articulate your interests, concerns, motivations, and what you hope to achieve. It is recommended that goals should be clarified before determining your objectives, parameters of interest, and data collection methods, because your goals will help inform those decisions. And so some common water quality goals include evaluating current conditions, establishing a baseline for future comparison, identifying sources of pollution, evaluating if projects effectively improved water quality. So this could be kind of maybe like post-restoration monitoring, or analyzing trends over time. So I'm going to go over 2 examples of a goal just to give you an idea. So one is address the algae concern in Spring Creek. It's pretty broad and simple, and it's related to current condition-based monitoring. And then a second goal could be identify pollution sources that are contributing to impairments in Del Creek, which is related to a source assessment-based goal. So now that you might have a goal defined, you need to determine your objective. So an objective is more focused than a goal and outlines specific and measurable steps to achieving your goal. So objectives should typically start with the word to and include the following details after that. So that's your what, where, when, and why. So parameters kind of include your what. What types of data will you collect? What parameters are relevant to your interest and question? And you should consider chemical, biological, and physical parameters when answering that. Location includes your where. Describe the scale and location of your monitoring. Which watershed, which water bodies, which sites. Timing is your when. So determine an appropriate and feasible monitoring schedule as it relates to your parameters of interest and intended analyses. So which months are relevant? Do factors like time of year, flow, temperature, or light affect your parameters? And do you need to consider those? Which days are practical? So when are volunteers available? And will weekends affect your ability to ship samples within the allowable holding times? And that's something that's really, really important because you want to make sure that the samples arrive in time to be able to be analyzed. Otherwise, that's a waste of your time and your volunteers' time. So that's a really big consideration that I highly recommend. And then another thing is how many visits will you make to each site and how much time should pass between those visits? Is that weekly visits, monthly visits, or quarterly or something like that? And how many years will you monitor? Is this short-term or long-term like trend analysis? Context is your why. So although your goals help to explain why you're monitoring, you can incorporate additional context into your monitoring objectives to explain why your parameters, locations, and timing are relevant. So I'm going to go over one objective and kind of break down those sections so that you can kind of see what's an effective objective. So this example is to compare nitrate concentrations in Beaver Creek upstream and downstream from any town during July and August to determine whether leaking septic systems appear to be a source of excess nutrients. So we have our to compare statement at the beginning of that objective. Nitrate concentrations is our what. Beaver Creek upstream and downstream from any town is our location. July and August is our timing, and our why or context is to determine whether leaking septic systems appear to be a source of excess nutrients. And another example of an objective is to evaluate whether excess fine sediment is depositing in riffles in Deer Creek during base flow, thereby limiting fish and insect habitat. So kind of just to round this all out, taking the time to determine and articulate your program's goals and objectives will ensure that your monitoring and program efforts will produce outcomes your organization is interested in. When starting a monitoring program, your objectives may not be as detailed as the ones that I shared, but at least some thought should go into the details and why the data is being collected. Volunteer monitoring programs are most successful when the program is collecting data that they can understand and use themselves to answer the questions posed by the program's participants. So the last thing that we want to talk about is planning ahead. And this is a key and important to a successful program. So all groups, whether you are preparing to monitor for the first time or you have an established long-term monitoring project, you need to plan ahead, whether that's each year or before you even start. Your time is valuable and you want to avoid collecting data that already exists, isn't useful, or that you don't know how to interpret. And also monitoring requires knowledge, skill, equipment, and time. So being prepared in advance can help you meet your goals. So some examples of things that you should plan ahead is you need to keep your funding deadlines and timeframes in mind and know those, as well as know the requirements expected of you by your funding source. So for Rachel and I's programs, that includes reporting, submitting data, application requirements, all those need to be thought out. I recommend researching what data already exists. You can pull data from the National Water Quality Portal and see what data already exists in your area or the area that you're concerned about. Think about how your data can be used and how it will be analyzed. Do you or someone in your group have the ability to analyze and understand the data that you are collecting? And also and give yourself time to prepare needed documents like SAPs, SOPs, or quality assurance project plans, or what other documentation you need to have a successful monitoring program, and communicate that. So yeah, hopefully that's some helpful tips and tools. And I guess now we can go to the Q&A discussion for Rachel and I to answer questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rachel and Abbie. That was, yeah, just great, like comprehensive presentation there. Really appreciate that. And I just wanted to mention, since you both talked about their funding at the beginning, the Monitoring Montana Waters funding is already posted on the MWCC website on our funding page, and I'll drop that in the chat in a minute. And the DEQ funding will be up there next week ahead of Watershed News next week. Also, as I put in the chat box, we are going to have this record. I will get this recording, the slides out to everybody. This week might be wishful thinking, but certainly by early next week, and it'll also be in Watershed News next Thursday. So we'll be sure to have all that in there. So hopefully you didn't have to take too many notes, because you'll have the slides. And yeah, now we'll just take a few questions. And again, feel free to ask questions of Abbie and Rachel. Also ask questions of one another. You may have, it sounds like a lot of you, I think, have monitoring programs already. So yeah, questions? Well, I have one. I'm actually curious if anyone of those of you who already have existing monitoring programs or who have worked on one, what was your spark? Like, what was the thing that sparked this water monitoring program? Or if you don't have one, what is your purpose for wanting to start one?
Well, ours is not water quality monitoring, it's insect monitoring, but the spark was definitely, I think maybe different partners might have a little bit of a different take on this, but from my perspective, we're a reservoir controlled system. So there's definitely some disconnect between the normal seasonality of river flows and dam controlled outlet that keeps it very steady. And so I think a lot of people in the community don't really understand what goes into the water management, and they're just used to seeing a set amount of water flowing down the stream and maybe complaining, maybe not. But the insect monitoring is a good way to tie people into the general health and habitat of the stream, and then hopefully branch that out into fish health, which people are it's a lot easier to get people interested in fish health. So the insects are their food, and so that'll tie people into the fish, and then it's a way to get the community out and actually involved in doing something and looking at the health of the river, instead of it just being some black box nebulous kind of thing.
Yeah, volunteer monitoring. I lived briefly in Central California about 20 years ago, and that was how I started my journey in the watershed world, was a volunteer monitoring program. So yeah.
I guess I could share. So we're Flathead Rivers Alliance, and we work on the Three Forks of the Flathead, which is a National Wild and Scenic Designated river. So we have the middle, the south, and the North Fork. So essentially the tributary to a major watershed basin eventually, and then the Columbia. What we were running into, just trying to get an idea of who all the players were, who's actually doing monitoring on our on the Three Forks, and also our waters are so pristine that other sub watersheds within the Flathead, they have watershed restoration plans. We do not on the Three Forks. We're very lucky that most of ours is public land. It's not heavily impacted, but we are seeing a big increase in people moving to the area, probably some old septic systems that exist. So trying to get a better lay of that. And then we've seen, as most of you have seen on your rivers, a big uptick in river recreation users. We also have quite a few people that do overnights as well. So even though the impact might not seem significant now, we're just trying to have an idea of what is the baseline data that exists, what is baseline data that we should be collecting soon, and then what should we actually be tracking as we go forward. And then some of you may work with them, adventure scientists out of Bozeman. They're doing volunteer water quality monitoring, very basic water quality monitoring on all the wild and scenic designated rivers in the United States. And that's only a 3-year project. So what now that we've come on board is they're already halfway through that project. So this is a great opportunity for us to step in, we'll start developing and step in and have a volunteer water monitoring program after that one wraps. But we need to understand, they were looking at very specific things and capturing data 3 years for the entire United States for wild and scenic rivers. But we want to know what's happening, what's the baseline, what do we need to be monitoring, and looking towards the future as far as impact. So it's a lot, but it's really exciting to build capacity around water quality monitoring just as a new organization. So that's our very long story short, short story long.
I talked to Flannery briefly last year about doing something, so I'm available when you guys need some assistance.
Perfect. You will be on my speed dial. I'm going to start reaching out to people soon. Thank you.
I actually have a friend who works for Adventure Scientists, not in that, but I didn't know they were doing that for all the wild and scenic river. That's interesting. Do you know of any other, like, are they reaching out to local groups so that the local groups know and maybe can do what you're doing and try to take over afterward or expand the program afterward?
Yeah, so I'm not aware, and I actually have that on my list as well, because there's volunteers in the community that are collecting the data. So they're not able to share the information as far as who the volunteers are with the agencies that with which they're partnered with. So definitely like the Forest Service, Park Service. I don't know if, I think there's a couple of other agencies, probably USGS and some other ones. So they're not allowed to share like what the volunteers' names are that monitoring. So that's something that we have permission from them, of course, because we're partners, to see if that's something that we can get from Adventure Scientists. We're able to get the data that's being collected in the reports through our government agency partners. So I'm not sure what they're doing at a local level as far as reaching out to other watershed groups. The only reason we know about it is because we're here and we're essentially a friends group of the Forest Service and the Park Service on the Three Forks, so the administrators. But yeah, that's a really good question. And I think if they can address that before they wrap up the project, there could be great success. And yeah, so
cool.
Great
Well,
question.
Thanks for sharing that.
So I have a question. I think a lot of us have seen different kinds of water quality monitoring projects. I mean, they go back decades at this point. And I'm wondering if you might have some insight as to the kinds of programs that seem to be more sustainable or broad reaching. I can already imagine, just seeing the evolution, that the projects that have more specific goals and measurable objectives, I've seen more and more of those requirements in the grants themselves, but are there other characteristics or qualities that you see when you look across programs that seem to make some, I don't know, more sustainable or exciting for folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So I think sometimes groups, volunteer monitoring groups that have longer term success, one thing that helps is having like a lead, like permanent staff. So like, for example, you have Zach, who's ahead of, the Beaverhead and his group. And then, but another example is the Sun River Watershed group, who has like a permanent, like paid staff to help keep that program going. And they have Big Sky members and also volunteers to do that monitoring effort. But sometimes having someone have a long-term lead in charge can help. And that could be someone who's, a non-profit where there might not be a permanent staff. Like I think of like the Helena, Lake Helena group. They don't have like any permanent paid positions, but they have a board and a volunteer group that keeps them going over time. So I think something like that, some consistency and leadership, I think is always helpful. Obviously change will occur, but having that structure can help. And I think continued like public engagement can also be really helpful to keep volunteers over the long term. So really thinking about different ways that groups can engage the public, I think is another benefit. So whether that's, I think, Zach, didn't you do like a Beaverhead? Maybe I'm thinking of a different group, but like sometimes I know the Big Hole does like a day with like out there, out on the water body, and like collects macros and gets kids involved in the community to like teach them about what their efforts are, but also get them involved with like what is a macroinvertebrate and stuff like that. So maybe planning like a day for the community to come out and learn what you do can also be helpful. Giving public presentations, being at the table is also good. So
Yeah, I didn't,
hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
yeah, I don't know if Rachel had anything to add there, but I had just a random thought that comes from, again, my own volunteer days, as well as like some of the watershed groups I work with. I mean, not to be silly, but like free food, right? I feel like free food gets local businesses engaged, right? It's an opportunity to be like, hey, do you support like our healthy watersheds that support our community and all the fly fishers who come to your restaurant? Like, I just think it's an easy thing where, you could ask like a different business every month or something, and then it's an incentive for the volunteers too. I always like to, try to get local, a lot of groups are doing that, but trying to get more local businesses engaged too. It's an easy way.
Yeah, I think all those things make a lot of sense. But definitely knowing why you're engaging in the effort, I think is really critical. I know some groups have gotten excited, collected a lot of data, worked really hard, and they're like, oh, what do we do with this now? Or why did we do all this work? And then it's kind of not exciting to keep going, right? If you don't have a important question. I think if there's a big driving factor on the landscape of we are so worried about this pollutant or something to, a big why or a big spark can definitely help. But everything Abbie said too.
Yeah.
Continuity and good communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that group I monitored 4 years ago, there was an old dam. It wasn't even hydropower. It was just like a flood control dam that was totally silted in, and and there was a lot of people in the community that wanted to see it taken out. And that was we were trying to establish that baseline for if it ever got taken out and then what would change. So yeah, having like a big goal that the community supports, or many people in the community support.
And then having obviously the funding. I mean, that's a big thing too, right? If they run out of money and they can't sample anymore. Mm-hmm. So at least our program joining the fray, there's quite a bit more, almost double the money now, or a little bit more available, for groups, which is great. So more and more groups can apply and know they have at least a solid chance of getting the funding to do those analyses, each year.
Yeah. That's another question too related.
I was just going to add that, like looking, there's potential like other funding opportunities outside of us. Like there's the mini grant program, and DNRC has other funding sources, especially if you're working on like restoration based efforts. So I think doing more research too before you maybe start some of your goals and objectives on funding sources can maybe help sustain that long-term funding source.
Yeah. Does everybody know what that does anybody not know what that mini grant program is? Yeah.
I don't think I can be a good person to explain that because I'm still learning about it myself.
Yeah.
So, but it's run through our 319 program. It's through DEQ, and that's all I think I can give you at the moment.
Got it. Well, it's funny when you said that. There's also, and this is, you'd have to ask MACD, but I know the Montana Association of Conservation Districts has an education mini grant program, right? So it's not for monitoring, but as we all know, if you're using volunteers, monitoring is definitely an educational activity, right? People are learning as they're doing their citizen science. So I don't know if, you'd have to reach out to MACD, but anything that's, community education could qualify too. And I wanted the question I was about to ask was for Rachel and Abbie. I know one of the challenges that a lot of groups face is ongoing funding, right? They might get that initial to start their program, but I actually don't know this about either of your programs. Are you able to fund groups for multiple years? Is it just a one-off and then you're on your own? How does that work?
Yeah, for both of us, you can apply each year. They are competitive. So MMW funded 7 different groups last year, and we actually had a little bit more money available, so we can do more than that. So if 30 groups apply, then of course not everyone's going to get funded, most likely. But at the moment, we can fund most of the groups. Depends on how many applications we get, and so they're competitive. So really articulating your why and what your objectives are and having a good plan and a solid SAP, and you have a good chance of being funded to collect that data. And there's no limit on the number of years you can apply or anything like that.
Yep, and we're in the same spot, and we've had a couple groups that have been funded through us since the beginning of our program. I think one of the groups that's been funded the longest and consistently is the Sun River Watershed Group. They have monitoring. They've been monitoring for almost the last 20 years. Maybe Connor can correct me because he worked with them. But yeah, they've been an established group for a very long time. And so they've received funding from us multiple years. Yeah, I think we funded 9 groups. And I think out of the 9 groups, 7 of them were returning groups. So, and we are at our max with we give out all of our money every year, so that also depends on like how much each group is giving, but we fund about 9 groups consistently with our funding source. So, and
I guess it would be good to articulate so the folks on this call know Abbie and I work closely together, and so we are very aware of what to who. And we have the same stipulations and funding. So it's not like you can get the same funding for the same question from both of us because we just pay the lab. So good to communicate early. We're both open to any questions or help you might need. We also commonly will both help support a group and like split the costs or something like that too. So there's a lot of options like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good thing to, with a lot of funders, I feel like a lot of us coordinate to some extent or try to, so it's a good thing to, if you're applying for multiple sources to, yeah, do that. I was curious, Connor, if you're still there, did you have any insights from the Sun River? Just, I mean, I know you're not leading that effort or anything, but any like positive or, just good things that you see them doing with all their experience?
Yeah, I've only been involved with the program for 2 years, but I think you're right, Abbie. I think it's been running for close to 20 years. They had one volunteer, I think his name is Ray Hahn, who I think kind of ran the monitoring show for pretty much that entire time. So I think that's pretty cool. And I think the direction Tracy's looking to head is having somebody kind of established, as you were saying earlier, to kind of a consistent figure. Because I don't think I'll be doing it this year. I think we have a Big Sky member who's going to be doing it. But yeah, I'm sorry, what was the question? Just I kind of, yeah.
Okay, I called on you randomly, so thanks for answering. No, I was just wondering, we've been talking about like ways to keep volunteers engaged, ways to keep your funding sources going. Like, are there any things that you've seen the Sun River Watershed Group do well in those respects or other respects?
Yeah, I think I think what we're really focusing on, just based on discussions with Tracy, and she kind of runs the show, but is kind of engaging in a larger volunteer kind of getting more volunteers involved and more like from the public, because a lot of people we pull on right now are like Big Sky members and people are kind of already in touch with the conservation community. So I think that's actually something I've noted for like to talk to her about, is kind of pushing that outreach to get a little more diverse population coming from, I guess, like background experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good point. Thanks.
I think another thing that's helped them recently is they've re-looked at their goals and objective for their long-term monitoring project. So reevaluating your goals and objectives over time is also a good thing to do, to kind of get back to, are these goals and objectives like what we originally intended or where we are wanting to go? So yeah, evaluating them over time is also a good thing. And I think that's what's helped them move forward in the last couple of years.
And then also just, I'm going to throw out, we said plan ahead earlier, but really, really plan ahead. I mean, it's really easy to be like, oh, it's due March 1st. I'm going to put that off, or I'm going to enter my data the last week and then I'm going to do my new application. But if you've never done a SAP, they're really long. And that can prevent some groups from applying, but it shouldn't. And there's a reason for all the details that are required, because you're investing a lot of time and energy into collecting these data, and you want to make sure you have all the details figured out beforehand so those data can be used. But it can be daunting the first time somebody looks at the SAP template. So just reach out for help. Need help, because we're here to help.
Yeah, thanks for saying that.
And work with partners. That's how we really lucked out with our insect monitoring, is we had a FWP partner who had just hired a person straight out of grad school who had done aquatic insect monitoring. I don't know exactly what his master's degree was, but it had something to do with that. So for him to throw together the sampling and analysis plan was really not that big of a deal. It was just the sort of thing he would have done in school. Whereas if I had needed to do it, I'd still be working on it. We wouldn't have a season of monitoring behind us already. So,
or you could have reached out to MMW, Zach, and we could have helped you along.
That's true. So, but and that proves my point. And that is also my point. Is like the partnering up on this stuff is huge. It helps a ton, because yeah, you can't do it. You can do it all in house, but there's no need to.
Yeah, and I think looking for people in your community that can volunteer their time and help that with the expertise. So I'm going to use an example. So Stillwater Valley Watershed Council got a volunteer in Tom Osborne, who was a consultant with Hydro Solutions, who did this too as his job. So looking and knowing people in your community that might have a background in this to volunteer their time can be beneficial to you as a group. And then also, yeah, we're here to help too. But approaching us mid-February for due date of February 25th, maybe not the best idea. Approaching us in November in the fall, yeah, that's a better idea.
And I also wanted to just very specifically open up to Claire and Carrie, our Big Sky Watershed Core members. I know you're new to this, but do you two have any questions or anything you wanted to add?
I was just wondering what kind of organizations are applying for these fundings? Is it usually conservation districts and places like that, or who do you usually
No, so our stipulation is that it has to be citizen-led water quality monitoring. But Carrie, you're with the Missoula Valley Water District, right? That's correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you guys have a group of volunteers that works with you. So you were funded by DEQ and MMW last year because you have a volunteer group collecting data. So we weren't specifically, if it was just the water quality district doing all the work, we wouldn't be able to fund the water quality district, but because it's a volunteer group that you guys are assisting, we were able to fund that effort. But like river foundations and river alliances and any kind of citizen-led group are the most common types of groups that we're funding.
Okay, cool, thank you.
We have it slightly different and sometimes take it on a case by case basis, especially if there's certain areas that our program wants to focus on or that we can't divert staff resources to. So we fund conservation districts, water quality districts, nonprofit groups. So, nonprofit like lake associations or river groups. So we vary a little bit, and our component is that you just have to have some sort of volunteer monitoring part to your program. So whether that's educational aspects, so like whether you're going to go and present this research to community and other aspects, or you do have volunteers involved. So our eligibility requirements are clearly spelled out in our call for application. So I would highly recommend you looking at those, and then or if you just have questions, let me know. We also will fund schools. So the Flathead Community College, maybe correct me on that, Rachel.
Flathead Valley.
Flathead Valley, yeah.
Yeah.
So they've reached out to me and they want to use students and other community members to create a volunteer monitoring program, and they would be eligible because we do include like schools in there too.
Oh, Abby, they talked to me too, but we haven't talked about that. So yeah, that's interesting.
And we need to talk about that.
Yeah, we should.
Maybe that's why they didn't call me back. Who knows?
I don't know. Anyways, if you have a question and you're not sure you're eligible, reach out and talk to us, because it just depends on the circumstance. It's not super set in stone. So
we don't fund private businesses though, and that's partly because our funding source is EPA grant funding. So that's another important note for us, for people to know, if you have a match requirement from other funding sources and that can't be federal funding, you can't use us because we're a federally funded program. So just a heads up, because sometimes people don't know that.
Definitely good to know. Great. Well, looks like we have time for one more question. And I've got just a couple quick announcements for the end here, but if we have one more question, feel free. Okay, I don't see anyone going for the unmute button. Just a reminder that we're hosting these lunchtime conservation conversations once a month now. It's always on a Wednesday at noon. The next two come and all of this, everything that I'm saying, well, for one thing, I'll drop this link in the chat here. You can find information about upcoming lunchtime conservation conversations on our training page. You have to scroll down at the top. There's actually a capacity workshop that we just announced. Some of you may have that in your inboxes right now. We just announced a capacity workshop that we're going to be hosting with Future West on May 19th. So very different from monitoring. This is more like organizational capacity, but feel free to put that on your calendars. That's at the top of that page that I just put the link to. But if you scroll down, you'll see the lunchtime conservation conversations. And February 23rd, Jeff Ryan, who's a supervisor with the Lewis and Clark Conservation District and also just has this lifetime of restoration experience. He's going to be talking about soft stream bank restoration using willows. And then on March 16th, Karen Boyd, who's this amazing fluvial geomorphologist with stream based out of Bozeman, is going to be talking about stream geomorphology. For those of you who might be working on those types of projects, it's going to be all about really thinking about where the river is headed before you do the project. So those are both up there. The registration links for both of those are available. All of these conversations are free and will continue to be. Like I said, you can sign up through the training page. And also, I think you all are on, but if you're not, I'll drop it in for the heck of it. But we do announce all these things in Watershed News. And this conversation, as well as more information about Abbie's, the DEQ monitoring funding, will be in the Watershed News next Thursday, the 20th. The recording and the slides for this presentation will be in there too, as well as I think a link to another resource that Abbie has. But I will, since you all were here and the people who signed up and didn't actually make it today, I will get all that stuff out to you specifically in an email before that. And then last thing, I will soon after this, maybe tomorrow, today or tomorrow, you'll all get an email with just 3 really short questions asking for your feedback on this. And so if you want to shoot me a couple, any of your thoughts on how we can improve these or any changes you would like to see, that would be great too. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, especially Rachel and Abbie. I know you guys spent a lot of time on this working together and trying to highlight both of your programs and all the great things that you do. So thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. It's nice to join everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.